There is a mental health disorder that affects over 1 million people in the UK and over 6 million people in the United States. And yet, despite that, it's still relatively unheard of compared to issues like anxiety and depression. Now, this is a mental health disorder that I experienced for about 10 years. And it kind of almost ruined my life, and I almost lost my mind because many of the symptoms are pretty much quite disturbing and terrifying. And one of the reasons why they're so scary is because even till now, there doesn't seem to be an agreed upon explanation as to why these symptoms occur in the first place. And this is often why it becomes so scary, because we just don't really understand what's going on. You can go online, look at forums, and you'll see all kinds of explanations. And even with specialists, although they have good explanations, there isn't a complete definite answer to these questions, which is why it becomes scary. This mental health disorder is known as depersonalization disorder. So if you don't know who I am, my name is Rumzi, and about 10 years ago I was diagnosed with depersonalization disorder. However, this year in 2020, I'm effectively almost completely fully recovered, and so there are only really minor symptoms left, and I see them gradually day by day vanishing, and I've managed to achieve this with no medication at all. And so in this video I want to share with you one of the major things that I learned in the recovery journey that seriously helped me to start actually improving. And I wish I knew this 10 years ago when I was experiencing the really disturbing symptoms. You see, a major part of what makes depersonalization disorder so scary is that the symptoms themselves create more symptoms. And this is because when we start experiencing these disturbing symptoms, which I'll explain in a short while, the fear of the symptoms generates anxiety, which creates more symptoms. And so we can get stuck in this loop, which is generating more and more symptoms from the fear that's being created from them. And so it's vital that you first understand why these symptoms are occurring in the first place so that you can start to reduce the fear of them. And we ultimately fear these symptoms and what's going on because we don't really understand what's happening. And so our mind has a habit of projecting the worst case scenarios when we come across something unknown. And I believe it does this because it thinks it's preparing us for a worst case scenario. So once I understood why depersonalization occurred in the first place, and once I also learnt why I was experiencing specific symptoms as well, that seriously helped to reduce the anxiety and the fear around the symptoms, which gradually over time then started to reduce the symptoms. So before we continue, I need to make it clear that I'm not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist, I'm somebody who has been through the recovery journey and is essentially at the end of it, almost fully recovered. And through trial and error, through working with therapists and professionals, through my own research, through study and practice, I am presenting to you my own opinion to explain what I would do if I was starting the recovery journey all over again, based on what I've learned now. And this video is not meant to be an in-depth explanation of how to recover or what the disorder is. If you want to learn more about that, I made a video, so if you click the link up here or in the description, that goes into much more detail. Also, don't forget to click the subscribe button to be notified of when I release the next videos. Okay, so for those who don't know, depersonalization disorder is a dissociative disorder. And so for somebody experiencing depersonalization, the major two symptoms are experiencing a detachment from their reality and or a detachment from themselves, as in their own identity or their own body. And so depersonalization is the name given to the symptoms about detachment from the body and the self, and derealization is the name given to symptoms related to the detachment from their external world, from their reality. And so I had both sets of symptoms to varying degrees for about 10 years, pretty much 24/7. And so here's a selection of some of the type of symptoms I experienced. So I was essentially experiencing life like it was a non-stop dream that I couldn't wake up from. It felt like I was looking into someone else's body while I was inhabiting this body. So I look in the mirror and I sometimes couldn't actually recognize who I was seeing. It felt like I was just somebody else. So I became disconnected from the world because it seemed dreamlike. I became disconnected from my own body, because it didn't feel like it was my own. This meant that my physical sensations and emotional sensations seemed like they weren't my own, so I became quite emotionally numb, and even pain didn't feel that bad because I felt detached from it. So I essentially felt like a robot, to the point where even my own voice sounded like it was somebody else's. I also experienced really bad memory and concentration problems due to the high levels of anxiety I was experiencing. And so this also distorted my perception of time. I also had constantly intrusive thoughts that were questioning my own existence because of these experiences. I was seeing 3D visual distortions, like as kind of mist or static everywhere. I was seeing after images of things. Sometimes I would hear sounds being closer than they actually were. And so I essentially felt like I was dead but alive at the same time, like I was a ghost possessing someone else's body while living in a dream that I couldn't wake up from. So you can imagine being in that state of either being terrified or emotionally numb, and you can imagine how that affects your relationship. And I basically, for a while, couldn't really live a normal life. Okay, so that's an explanation as to the kind of things people can experience with depersonalization disorder. So now we need to look at what exactly causes this disorder. So essentially, I believe depersonalization occurs due to your mind and your nervous system being in a hypersensitive state. And so a part of your mind believes that there is a threat to your well-being, whether that's your physical, emotional, or mental well-being. So normally, if there's a threat, a physical threat in your environment, your mind will normally trigger a response known as the fight, flight, or freeze response. And it does this to make you either fight the threat, to run away, which is the flight, or to freeze. And we'll get into explaining what the freeze response is in a moment. But essentially, it chooses one of these options that it believes is the best way for you to survive. So the freeze response we usually see in animals when, let's say, a predator attacks them and they can't run and they can't fight it. Sometimes they play dead, and that often is a very good survival tactic because it makes a predator not go near them because they think they're dead. But in humans, the freeze response can occur through dissociation. So by detaching from the experience or from the physical pain somebody might have. And so a really good example of this is when we hear of people being in accidents or disaster situations, and they say they managed to escape because everything felt dreamlike, like it wasn't really happening. And after the experience was over, then they snapped back into reality. And that is the freeze mechanism working really well, because it's only meant to be on for a short time, and it helps the person to not panic. So by making everything seem dreamlike, they're very calm and they can escape and make good decisions to survive. However, with depersonalization disorder, that mechanism is on all the time. And it's not meant to be on all the time, it's meant to be a very short temporary survival mechanism. So with depersonalization disorder, we have to understand that there isn't actually an obvious threat. So we're not actually recognizing a physical threat necessarily. However, it seems like there's not a threat because the threat isn't there on the surface. So what I'm suggesting is that the mind is actually still perceiving there to be a threat. It's just the threat isn't actually necessarily in your physical environment. You can have mental and emotional threats too, because these can be threats to your well-being. So if you have, for example, a history of high levels of stress, anxiety, or some trauma, it's likely that your fight, flight, and freeze response has been triggered multiple times or for an extended period of time. And so what I believe is happening is that it's essentially training our minds and our nervous system to be and to stay in that hypersensitive state where your mind is constantly looking for and perceiving there to be threats. So from my own experiences, I do have a history of childhood trauma, prolonged stressful experiences, and multiple traumas later on in life. So the main one being that when I was a child, I witnessed my dad being abusive towards my mum in front of me, and then experienced many years of neglect from him, which then led to lots of long-term stressful experiences as a child, and in teenage years, multiple traumas there as well. And so what I believe was happening was this was all contributing to conditioning my mind and my nervous system to be in that hypersensitive state because it's experienced so many mental, emotional, and physical threats as well. And then interestingly, I actually experienced depersonalization disorder when I started my first job. So that was when real pressure was put on me for the first time. And so what I noticed in myself, and I believe others who have depersonalization disorder also probably experience too, is that when I would experience quite intense negative feeling emotions, I would experience more depersonalization symptoms. Also, if I had quite negative intrusive thoughts coming through, I would also start to experience more depersonalization symptoms. And so what this really meant was my own thoughts and my own emotions were being seen as a threat, which just kept my nervous system in that hypersensitive state. And this also applied to feelings I had about myself. So if I felt bad about myself, I noticed I felt more detached from myself. When I felt good about myself, I noticed I felt less detached and I felt more in my body. And so you may say, well, okay, I have depersonalization disorder, but I don't have any trauma. I don't have a history of any kind of stress, and I don't have anxiety, and yet I still have depersonalization symptoms. And so we really need to think about how we define trauma, and we need to redefine it. It doesn't have to be an obviously physically traumatic experience. Try to think of what would make a child feel high levels of stress. What could be traumatic for a child based on their limited perspective? So for example, getting lost in public for a few minutes, or maybe being embarrassed at school, or maybe, for example, bullying. That kind of thing can lead to prolonged stress and trauma. But also, I believe the big thing that's being missed out in understanding not just depersonalization disorder, but mental health issues themselves, is how we react to our own emotions. Because think about it this way, as children, and even in adulthood, we're never really taught how to handle our own emotions, especially if they're very intense. And we're never taught how to process and let go of them as well. So you can imagine that having very intense emotions as a child, and even as an adult, can be very stressful. So try to see trauma as a distressing experience that has not yet been processed and let go of. And so these experiences become suppressed within us and get repressed into our subconscious, because at that time we didn't know how to handle it because we weren't taught this. And our bodies and mind do this because it's the only way to deal with the very intense emotion. So I would suggest that you do have some trapped emotions and you do have subconscious stress and anxiety. It's just that you're currently unaware of it. And this is something that happened to me where I would think that I didn't have anxiety. I would think that I didn't have any more traumatic experiences of the process. And then I would discover more that I was just unaware of and had to learn how to release. And so this is something that you really must understand. Your mind and your body is always trying to help you. It's trying to protect your well-being and to ensure your survival. And so the way I see depersonalization disorder is that it's your mind and your nervous system being constantly stuck in the fight, flight, or freeze response because of what it perceives to be a threat to your well-being in an attempt to protect you. So I personally don't even like calling depersonalization disorder a disorder. It's really an adaptation. It's an adaptation to stress, anxiety, or trauma, or all of these things depending on the person. And so this really starts to explain the visual symptoms and the audio symptoms, because your mind is not meant to be in that dissociative state for long periods of time. It's not meant to be in the hyper-aware, hypersensitive state. And so I suggest it's not only detaching you from the experience or from your body in an attempt to protect you from what it perceives to be a threat. I'm also going to suggest in being stuck in that hypersensitive state for long periods of time, it's almost like your mind is becoming stressed out and tired. So this explains the visual and audio distortions and why everything seems so scary with these symptoms, because your mind is not only detaching you from the experience and is staying in that hypersensitive state, but because it's not meant to be in that state for so long, I'm going to suggest that it starts getting tired out. And so it's almost like your mind is now over-processing this information in that hypersensitive state. And this can explain why, for example, like when I used to look at lights and look away, or if I used to look at somebody for a long period of time, the after images would appear, or I would hear audio that's meant to be far away really close. It's like the hypersensitive state is over-processing the information, which makes it seem different from what it actually is. So you have then two layers to that. You have not only the detachment as a way to protect you, but then you also have your mind over-processing information in this hypersensitive, stressed out state. Okay, so then you might be asking, well, what about the emotional numbness? How do we explain that? So I'm going to suggest there are two layers to that as well. So number one, you have the fact that if you're experiencing high levels of anxiety for long periods of time, high levels of stress, your body can't maintain that for a long period of time. And so eventually you're going to feel numb because your body's tired out. You can't maintain any emotional state forever. And so secondly, I'm going to suggest that the emotional numbness happens because you have trapped emotions. I know that sounds like a paradox, it sounds contradictory, but remember that numbness is still an emotion. If you really feel it, you'll see you're still feeling something. So what I realized through going through the recovery journey was that underneath the numbness were actual emotions, but these were the emotions that had been suppressed for so many years, especially in childhood, because I would have been too young to be able to actually handle them. So I'm going to suggest that the emotional numbness is a way for your mind and your body to protect you from the very intense emotions that you couldn't actually experience and release when you were younger or even during your adult life. And so ultimately, it is also a defense mechanism. So you could say there are three layers to this. You have the mind detaching from the external world to protect you, the mind detaching from your body because your own emotions are seen as a threat or your own thoughts are seen as a threat, and then the emotional numbness to protect you from the suppressed emotions that if they came out could be overwhelming and so could be dangerous to your own well-being from the mind's perspective. And so I learned this because the more I went for therapy, the more I used therapy to bring up suppressed emotions and memories so I could release them, then less depersonalization occurred. The more I was learning to feel my emotions, the more I was training my mind and my body that they're not a threat. And then through this process, the symptoms of depersonalization started to vanish. So I really hope this has helped, and I really hope that through understanding exactly why depersonalization occurs and what these symptoms are and why they happen, I really hope this helps you to start reducing the fear surrounding it, which can help to reduce the actual symptoms of the disorder. And remember, this is a process and it takes time. So go easy on yourself when you're going through this recovery process. Because what I experienced was when I would make progress and then sometimes I would go maybe take a few steps back, I'd start getting annoyed at myself, which would just create more anxiety, which of course can make the symptoms continue. So thanks for watching. Comment below to let me know of your experiences. Don't forget to click the like button if you found this to be useful, and subscribe to be notified of the next videos. Take care.